The morning sun cast long shadows across Riverside Park as Detective Maria Santos pulled into the gravel parking lot, her coffee still steaming in the cup holder. At 6:47 a.m., the emergency dispatch had crackled through her radio with words that made her stomach drop. Code 3, aggravated assault, minor witness on scene. 23 years on the force had taught her that cases involving children were always the hardest to solve and the most devastating to witness. As she stepped out of her unmarked sedan, the crisp October air carried an unsettling silence. Usually, the playground would be empty this early, but today it buzzed with activity that felt all wrong. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the air. Breeze like macabre party streamers, sectioning off the colorful jungle gym where children should have been laughing and playing. Instead, paramedics worked frantically over a motionless figure lying in the wood chips beneath the red spiral slide. Detective Santos approached the scene methodically, her trained eyes scanning every detail. Blood droplets created a disturbing pattern across the bright blue and yellow playground equipment, looking almost artistic against the cheerful colors, until the reality of violence hit her. The victim appeared to be a young Hispanic woman in her early 20s, her long black hair matted with blood and dirt. Her purse contents were scattered across the mulched lipstick, car keys, crumpled dollar bills, and a small wallet with photos of a smiling toddler spilling from its corners. "What do we have, Rodriguez?" Santos called to Officer Carlos Rodriguez, who was carefully photographing evidence near the swing set. Jessica Martinez, 22 years old babysitter, Rodriguez replied without looking up from his camera. Severe head trauma, multiple lacerations on her arms and hands. "But detective, there's something really strange about these wounds." He gestured toward the victim's forearms, where EMT Sarah Chun was cleaning deep puncture marks. "These look like bite marks, but they're too big and too deep to be human. Animal control is on their way." Santos nodded grimly and turned her attention to the most important witness in any crime scene, the person who saw everything unfold, sitting motionless. On the blue swing, his tiny legs barely reaching the ground, was 3-year-old Tommy Rodriguez. The boy's appearance broke her heart immediately. His bright red Mickey Mouse t-shirt was torn at the shoulder, and chocolate ice cream, from what must have been an earlier treat, had melted down his small hands, creating brown streaks across his palms and fingers. But it was his eyes that haunted her most, wide, dark, and filled with a terror no child should ever experience. Tommy's grandmother, Elena Rodriguez, knelt beside the swing, her weathered hands trembling as she tried to coax some response from her grandson. Tears streamed down her lined face as she whispered in Spanish, "Mio, por favor, hable. Tell Abuela what happened. ¿Qué pasó aquí?" Detective Santos approached slowly, knowing that her first interaction with this traumatized child could determine the entire course of the investigation. She crouched down to Tommy's eye level, keeping her voice soft and non-threatening. "Hi there, Tommy. My name is Detective Santos. Can you tell me what you saw here this morning?" The boy's response chilled her to the bone. Nothing, not a word, not a gesture, not even acknowledgement that she had spoken. Tommy simply stared past her with those haunting eyes, as if he was looking at something terrible that only he could see. His small body remained rigid on the swing, unmoving except for the barely perceptible trembling of his lower lip. "He hasn't said a word since I found them," Elena explained, her voice cracking with emotion. "Tommy loves to talk, always asking questions, singing songs, telling stories. But when I got here to pick them up from their morning walk, I found Jessica on the ground and Tommy just sitting there like this. It's like someone stole his voice away." Dr. Patricia Williams, the department's consulting child psychologist, arrived within the hour. A woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail, She had seen countless cases of childhood trauma, but each one still affected her deeply. She spent 20 minutes simply observing Tommy from a distance, noting his body language, his breathing patterns, and his complete withdrawal from the world around him. Classic presentation of acute traumatic stress response, Dr. Williams whispered to Detective Santos as they watched the boy. Whatever he witnessed here was so overwhelming that his mind has essentially shut down to protect him. The selective mutism could last days, weeks, or even months. We need to be very careful about how we proceed. As the crime scene team worked methodically around them, collecting evidence and photographing every angle, Detective Santos found herself drawn back to Tommy repeatedly. The contrast was heartbreaking: emergency vehicles with flashing lights, adults shouting instructions, radios crackling with urgent communications, and in the center of it all, one small boy sitting in complete, devastating silence. The paramedics prepared to transport Jessica Martinez to Mercy General Hospital, their faces grim as they worked to stabilize her vital signs. "She's in critical condition," EMT Chun reported. "Significant blood loss, possible skull fracture, and these bite wounds are deep enough to require surgery. If she makes it through the next 24 hours, she might have a chance." As Detective Santos watched the ambulance disappear down the tree-lined street, its sirens wailing, she realized the weight of what lay ahead. Without Jessica's testimony, without any adult witnesses, and with security cameras that had mysteriously malfunctioned the night before, Tommy Rodriguez was their only hope for justice. But first, they had to find a way to unlock the terrifying memories trapped inside a traumatized 3-year-old's mind, memories that might be the key to catching a dangerous predator who was still walking free. The chocolate ice cream continued to drip from Tommy's small hands, falling drop by drop onto the wood chips below, marking time in a case that would test everyone involved in ways they never imagined. 3 weeks had crawled by since that horrific morning at Riverside Park, and Detective Maria Santos felt the weight of failure pressing down on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Her desk at the precinct had become a graveyard of dead leads, manila folders stuffed with witness statements. That led nowhere. Grainy security footage that revealed nothing, and forensic reports that raised more questions than answers. The coffee-stained caseboard in the conference room told the story of her frustration. Dozens of red pins marking locations, suspect photos with large red X's drawn across them, and timeline charts that seemed to mock her with their emptiness. Jessica Martinez remained in the intensive care unit at Mercy General Hospital, her condition slowly improving, but her memories of that terrible morning completely erased. Dr. Samuel Chun, her attending physician, had explained to Detective Santos that retrograde amnesia following severe head trauma wasn't uncommon, but it didn't make the reality any less devastating for the investigation. Jessica could remember her childhood, her family, even what she had eaten for dinner 2 nights before the attack. But the crucial moments when her life nearly ended remained locked away, possibly forever. "I keep trying to remember," Jessica had whispered during Santos's most recent visit, her voice barely audible through the bandages covering her facial wounds. "Sometimes I think I can almost see something, a shadow, maybe a sound, but then it slips away like water through my fingers. I'm so sorry, I can't help you catch whoever did this to me." A lack of physical evidence continued to plague the investigation. The park's security camera system had experienced what the city's IT department called a catastrophic system failure sometime between 11 p.m. the night before the attack and 6 a.m. the morning Jessica was found. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, suggesting their perpetrator had technical knowledge or inside access to the park systems. Digital forensics experts had spent days trying to recover even fragments of data, but whoever had sabotaged the system had done so with professional precision. Detective Santos had canvassed the neighborhood surrounding Riverside Park 7 times, knocking on every door within a 6-block radius. Most residents had been sleeping during the early morning hours when the attack occurred. Mrs. Catherine Williams, an elderly widow who lived directly across from the park's main entrance, had initially seemed promising. She was known to wake up early and often watched the park through her kitchen window while having her morning coffee. But her failing eyesight and the distance had rendered her observations useless. "I might have seen someone walking around the playground area," Mrs. Williams had told Santos, squinting through thick glasses. "But it could have been a jogger. Or maybe it was just the shadows from the trees. I'm afraid I'm not much help, dear." The most frustrating aspect of the investigation centered on the mysterious bite marks that had nearly cost Jessica her life. Dr. Margaret Foster, the forensic veterinarian brought in to analyze the wounds, had confirmed that they definitely came from a large dog, likely a pit bull, German shepherd, or similar breed, weighing at least 60 pounds. The attack pattern suggested the animal had been trained or commanded to bite and hold, rather than the quick, defensive bites typically seen in random dog attacks. This wasn't a frightened or provoked animal, Dr. Foster had explained during her presentation to the task force. The bite pattern shows deliberate targeting of vulnerable areas, the forearms, which indicates the victim was trying to defend herself, and the back of the neck, which could have been fatal if the dog had maintained its grip for a few more seconds. Someone trained this animal to attack on command. Animal Control Officer Jake Morrison had helped Santos compile a list of every registered dog in the area that matched the size and breed profile, but the canvas had yielded nothing suspicious. They had interviewed 37 dog owners, visited local veterinary clinics, and even checked with underground dog-fighting rings that the narcotics division had been monitoring. Each lead had evaporated under scrutiny, leaving them no closer to finding their four-legged weapon or its handler. The case had attracted unwanted media attention, with Channel 7 News running daily updates about the park attacker and demanding answers from the police department. Captain Robert Hayes had shielded Santos from most of the political pressure, but she could see the strain in his eyes during their daily briefings. The city council was asking pointed questions about public safety, and parents were avoiding Riverside Park entirely, treating it like a contaminated zone. But the most heartbreaking aspect of the stalled investigation was watching Tommy Rodriguez retreat further into his traumatic silence. Dr. Patricia Williams had been working with the 3-year-old twice weekly, employing every therapeutic technique in her considerable arsenal. Art therapy sessions produced only black scribbles. Play therapy with dolls and action figures resulted in Tommy simply sitting motionless, staring at the toys without touching them. Even attempts at basic communication through pointing or nodding were met with the same blank, terrified stare that had haunted Detective Santos since that first morning. Elena Rodriguez, Tommy's grandmother, had aged years in the past 3 weeks. The vibrant woman who had initially been so determined to help her grandson heal now moved through her daily routine like a sleepwalker. He used to wake up singing, she had confided to Santos during their last meeting. Tommy would bounce out of bed every morning, asking me what adventures we were going to have that day. Now he won't even look at me. It's like whoever did this didn't just attack Jessica, they killed my grandson's spirit too. The community's faith in the police department was eroding with each passing day. Santos received anonymous calls from concerned citizens demanding updates, and the department's tip line had been flooded with false leads and conspiracy theories. One caller insisted the attack had been carried out by a pack of wild coyotes. Another claimed to have seen a man training attack dogs in the abandoned warehouse district, but when officers investigated, they found only empty buildings and homeless encampments. As Detective Santos sat in her car outside the hospital after another fruitless visit with Jessica, she realized that time was becoming her enemy. Physical evidence was degrading, witnesses' memories were fading, and most critically, Tommy's. Trauma was deepening with each day that passed without resolution. She needed a breakthrough, and she needed it soon, before the case joined the growing stack of unsolved files in the precinct's basement, storage room, and before a dangerous predator struck again. The break in the Riverside Park case came from the most unexpected source imaginable, a routine drug bust 3 miles away in the rundown industrial district that most decent people avoided after dark. Detective Maria Santos had almost given up hope when her phone rang at 2:47 a.m. on a frigid November morning, jolting her from the restless sleep that had become her nightly companion since the investigation began. "Santos, you need to get down. Here right now." Officer Mike Chun's voice crackled through the static. "We've got something on your park case, something big." 20 minutes later, Santos pulled up to a decrepit apartment complex called Sunset Gardens, though there hadn't been a garden in sight for decades. The building's exterior was a patchwork of peeling paint and broken windows, with graffiti covering every available surface. Police cars surrounded the structure like vultures, their red and blue lights casting eerie shadows across the cracked parking lot, littered with broken glass and abandoned shopping carts. The arrest had been purely coincidental. Jake Morrison, a 29-year-old auto mechanic with a scraggly beard and nervous eyes, had been the target of a months-long narcotics investigation. Detective Rick Thompson from the drug unit had been tracking Morrison's connection to a methamphetamine distribution ring, obtaining surveillance footage of him making transactions behind a local pool hall. When they'd finally moved to arrest him, Morrison had bolted from his apartment like a man with much more to hide than just drug dealing. He ran like his life depended on it, Officer Chun explained as he led Santos to the building's dimly lit hallway, where the stench of mold and neglect hung in the air like a toxic fog. "Took 4 of us to bring him down, and he kept screaming about how he didn't understand, that he was protecting people from the beast. We thought he was just high and paranoid until we got inside his apartment." The apartment door stood open, revealing what could only be described as a chamber of horrors. The living room was virtually empty, except for drug paraphernalia, scattered across a stained coffee table and holes punched through the drywall in fits of rage. But it was the sounds coming from the basement that had stopped the arresting officers in their tracks. A deep, guttural growling that seemed to shake the building's foundation, followed by the rattling of heavy chains. Animal Control Officer Sarah Martinez had arrived 30 minutes before Santos, and her face was pale with a mixture of fear and disgust. "Detective, I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what's down in that basement," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "That animal ... It's not just neglected. It's been systematically abused and trained to be a weapon." The basement was accessible only through a narrow wooden staircase that creaked ominously under their weight. Santos followed Martinez down into the darkness, her hand instinctively moving to her service weapon. The smell hit. Her first a nauseating combination of urine, feces, rotting food, and something else that made her stomach churn. As Martinez's flashlight illuminated the far corner of the basement, Santos saw the source of the terrifying sounds that had been echoing through the building. Chained to a steel post with logging chain thick, enough to anchor a boat, was the largest pit bull Santos had ever encountered. The dog had to weigh at least 80 pounds, with muscles that rippled beneath its scarred hide like coiled steel cables. Its massive head was crisscrossed with old wounds that spoke of countless fights, and its eyes held a rage that seemed almost human in its intensity. When the flashlight beam hit the animal, it launched itself forward with such violence that the chain snapped taut with a sound like a gunshot, causing both women to stumble backward. "My God," Santos whispered, her heart pounding as she took in the full scope of the horrific scene. The concrete floor around the dog was stained with what appeared to be blood, and scattered throughout the basement were various pieces of training equipment bite sleeves, tug ropes, and most disturbing of all, a collection of warm clothing that had clearly been used to teach the animal to attack humans on command. Martinez pointed to a corner where a makeshift fighting ring had been constructed with plywood walls and chain-link fencing. Based on the evidence down here, Morrison wasn't just training this animal for protection. This is a full-scale dog fighting operation, and from the looks of those bite training aids, he was also teaching it to attack people specifically. The breakthrough came when Dr. Margaret Foster, the forensic veterinarian, arrived to sedate the animal for evidence collection. Despite the dog's aggressive behavior, she managed to obtain saliva samples from its massive jaws, while animal control officers prepared a specialized transport cage. The preliminary field test results were promising, but everyone knew they'd have to wait for the full DNA analysis to confirm what they all suspected. Jake Morrison, meanwhile, had been processed and placed in holding, where his demeanor had shifted from panicked flight to sullen defiance. When Detective Santos interviewed him, he sat slouched in the metal chair, his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on the table between them. His story was as inconsistent as it was unbelievable. "I don't know what you're talking about," Morrison insisted, his voice rough from years of smoking. "Titan, that's my dog's name. He's just a guard dog. I keep him chained up because the apartment doesn't allow pets. I've never hurt anybody, and neither has he." But the evidence mounting against Morrison told a different story entirely. His fingerprints were found on the training equipment in the basement, and neighbors reported hearing sounds of dogfighting coming from the building at all hours of the night. Most damning of all, Morrison's cell phone records placed him in the vicinity of Riverside Park on the morning of Jessica Martinez's attack, a detail that made Santos's pulse quicken with anticipation. "We found brass knuckles in his jacket pocket," Officer Chon reported during the team briefing. And get this, he had Jessica Martinez's driver's license photo printed out and tucked into his wallet. When we asked him about it, he claimed he found it in the park and was planning to return it, but couldn't explain why he'd been carrying it around for 6 weeks. The DNA results came back 48 hours later, and they were exactly what Detective Santos had been hoping for. The saliva samples from Morrison's pit bull were a perfect match for the biological evidence found in Jessica's bite wounds. After weeks of chasing shadows and following dead ends, they finally had their weapon and potentially their perpetrator. But Morrison's claims of innocence, however implausible, meant that the case was far from closed. Without Tommy Rodriguez's eyewitness testimony, proving that Morrison had commanded his dog to attack, Jessica would require building an airtight circumstantial case that could withstand the scrutiny of a skilled defense attorney. The district attorney's office, on the 13th floor of the downtown courthouse, buzzed with an energy that prosecutor Linda Chun hadn't felt in years. Spread across the massive oak conference table were crime scene photographs, DNA reports, witness statements, and legal precedents, the ammunition she would need to bring Jake Morrison to justice. But despite the mountain of evidence, Chun knew she was facing the most challenging case of her 15-year career as a prosecutor. "Let's be brutally honest here," Chun addressed her team as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "We have a solid circumstantial case, but circumstantial cases lose all the time, especially when they hinge on animal attacks. Richard Stone is going to tear us apart if we can't put Tommy Rodriguez on that witness stand." Richard Stone was a legend in criminal defense circles, a silver-haired attorney with piercing blue eyes and a reputation for dismantling prosecutions with surgical precision. In 32 years of practice, he had secured acquittals in cases that seemed impossible to defend, earning him the nickname, the Magician, among courthouse staff. Stone had already begun his media campaign, appearing on local news programs to suggest that his client was being railroaded by an overzealous Police department desperate to close a high-profile case. The prosecution wants you to believe that. My client commanded his dog to attack an innocent young woman. Stone had told Channel 7 News just 2 days earlier, his voice carrying the perfect blend of outrage and reasoned concern. But where's their proof? Where's their eyewitness? They're asking a jury to convict a man based on speculation and coincidence, not facts. The challenge of using Tommy Rodriguez as a witness had kept Sean awake for countless nights. At 3 years old, Tommy would be the youngest witness ever to testify in a felony case in their jurisdiction. Legal precedent existed for child witnesses, but most involved children who were at least 5 or 6 years old and had been specifically coached. For months before trial, Tommy remained locked in selective mutism, speaking only occasionally to his grandmother about mundane topics, like wanting juice or needing to use the bathroom, never about the traumatic events at Riverside Park. Dr. Sarah Williams, the renowned child trauma specialist who had been working with Tommy, had flown in from the Children's Hospital in Chicago specifically for this case. Her reputation for helping traumatized children recover their voices was legendary, but even she admitted that Tommy's case was unlike anything she had encountered in 25 years of practice. The boy's mind has constructed elaborate defense mechanisms to protect him from reliving that morning, Dr. Williams explained during her consultation with the prosecution team. Every time his subconscious approaches those memories, it triggers a flight response that shuts down his verbal communication entirely. We've tried hypnotherapy, art therapy, play therapy with anatomically correct dolls, even equine therapy with specially trained horses. Nothing has unlocked those specific memories. The breakthrough attempts had been heartbreaking to witness. Tommy's grandmother, Elena Rodriguez, had brought in photo albums from before the attack, showing a vibrant, talkative little boy who loved to sing Disney songs and tell elaborate stories about imaginary adventures. In one video taken just days before the assault, Tommy could be seen dancing around the living room, chattering nonstop about a butterfly he had seen in the park, his eyes bright with the innocent joy that trauma had stolen from him. The hardest part, Elena had confided to Dr. Williams, is that I can see him trying to tell me something sometimes. He'll start to speak, his lips will move, but then he'll just freeze up and retreat back into silence. It's like watching someone drowning and being unable to throw them a rope. The legal team had consulted with experts across the country, searching for precedents and innovative approaches that might help Tommy testify without re-traumatizing him further. Judge Patricia Harrison, who would preside over the trial, had agreed to consider accommodations such as allowing Tommy to testify via closed-circuit television or having a therapy dog present in the courtroom. But even those modifications required Tommy to be able to speak coherently about what he had witnessed. Assistant District Attorney Mark Stevens, Chin's second chair, had been researching the forensic evidence with obsessive detail, hoping to build a case strong enough to secure conviction without Tommy's testimony. The DNA evidence linking Morrison's pit bull to Jessica's wounds was ironclad, but Stone had already signaled his intention to argue that someone else had used Morrison's dog as a weapon, possibly after stealing or borrowing it without Morrison's knowledge. Morrison's claiming he was at work that morning, Stevens reported during their strategy session. His supervisor at Murphy's Auto Repair says he was supposed to be there, but admits he didn't actually see Morrison until almost 10 a.m. That gives him a window to have been at the park during the attack and still make it to work. The most frustrating aspect of the case was Morrison's girlfriend, Crystal Valdez, who had initially seemed like a promising witness. Valdez had lived with Morrison for 8 months before the attack and had first-hand knowledge of his treatment of the pit bull and his increasingly erratic behavior. But during preliminary interviews, she had recanted her earlier statements about Morrison training the dog to attack on command. "She's scared," Detective Santos had explained to the prosecution team. Morrison has a history of domestic violence, and Valdez knows that if she testifies against him, she'd be looking over her shoulder for the rest of her life. Even if he goes to prison, he has associates who could retaliate against her. The pressure from the community continued to mount. As the trial date approached, Jessica Martinez had made a remarkable physical recovery, but her emotional scars ran deep. She had been attending therapy twice weekly and had started a support group for assault survivors. But the lack of closure from not remembering her attack had left her in a constant state of anxiety. "I know this sounds selfish," Jessica had told Chun during their most recent meeting, "but I need to see that man convicted. I need to know that he can't hurt anyone else the way he hurt me. And somehow, I feel like Tommy is the key to everything. That little boy saw something that could put Morrison away forever, but we just can't reach him." As the trial date loomed just 2 weeks away, Chun found herself making a decision that could determine the outcome of the entire case. She would gamble everything on one last attempt to help Tommy find his voice, even if it meant risking the prosecution's credibility in front of a jury. The stakes had never been higher, and failure wasn't just about losing a case. It was about leaving a dangerous predator free to strike again. The morning of January 15th dawned gray and bitter cold, with a harsh wind whipping through downtown that seemed to mirror the tension crackling through Courtroom 4A. By 7:30 a.m., more than 2 hours before proceedings were scheduled to begin, a line of spectators stretched around the block, their breath forming white clouds in the frigid air, as they waited for a chance to witness what local media had dubbed the trial of the century. Judge Patricia Harrison surveyed the packed courtroom from her elevated bench, her steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her no-nonsense reputation. At 62, she had presided over hundreds of criminal cases, but the electric atmosphere in her courtroom that morning was unlike anything she had experienced. Every seat in the gallery was occupied, with reporters from 3 television stations positioned strategically near the front, their cameras capturing every moment for the evening news. Jake Morrison sat at the defense table wearing an ill-fitting navy blue suit that his court-appointed attorney had purchased from a discount store the previous day. His normally unkempt beard had been trimmed, and someone had attempted to tame his unruly hair, but nothing could disguise the barely contained hostility radiating from his dark eyes as he scanned the courtroom. Beside him, Richard Stone projected an aura of confident calm, his expensive charcoal suit and silk tie announcing to the jury that he was a man who won cases. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Harrison," the bailiff announced, and the courtroom erupted in a cacophony of shuffling feet and rustling clothing as nearly 200 people stood in unison. The jury selection process had taken 3 grueling days, with both sides carefully scrutinizing potential jurors for any hint of bias. The final 12 consisted of 7 women and 5 men ranging in age from 24 to 68, including a retired school principal, 2 mothers of young children, a construction foreman, and a veterinary technician whose knowledge of animal behavior could prove crucial to the case. Prosecutor Linda Chun rose to deliver her opening statement, her hands trembling almost imperceptibly as she approached the lectern. She had spent countless hours rehearsing these words, but standing before the jury with Jake Morrison's cold stare boring into her back, the weight of responsibility felt crushing. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Chun began, her voice strong and clear despite her nerves. 6 months ago, a 22-year-old woman named Jessica Martinez went to Riverside Park with 3-year-old Tommy Rodriguez for what should have been an ordinary morning walk. Instead, she became the victim of one of the most vicious and calculated attacks our community has ever witnessed. Chun moved gracefully across the courtroom, making eye contact with each juror as she painted the picture of that horrific morning. The evidence will show that Jake Morrison deliberately unleashed his trained attack dog on Jessica Martinez, commanding the animal to maul her so severely that she nearly died. This wasn't a random dog attack, this was assault with a deadly weapon, and that weapon happened to have 4 legs and razor-sharp teeth. The prosecutor's opening statement lasted 43 minutes, during which she methodically outlined the DNA evidence linking Morrison's pit bull to Jessica's wounds, his suspicious behavior following the attack, and the discovery of Jessica's identification in his wallet. But she saved the most powerful moment for last. The prosecution will also present testimony from Tommy Rodriguez, the brave little boy who witnessed this horrific attack. Tommy's voice was stolen by trauma, but we believe that with your patience and understanding, he will find the courage to tell you what Jake Morrison did to Jessica Martinez that morning in the park. Defense attorney Richard Stone's opening was a masterpiece of reasonable doubt construction. Rising slowly from his chair, with the practiced grace of a man who commanded courtrooms, he began his counter-narrative with a sympathetic smile for the jury. "My client Jake Morrison is not a monster," Stone declared, his voice carrying just the right blend of conviction and compassion. "He's a working man who made some poor choices he deeply regrets, but he is not a would-be murderer." The prosecution wants you to believe that Jake commanded his dog to attack Jessica Martinez, but they have absolutely no evidence that he was even present when this terrible incident occurred. Stone spent the next 30 minutes systematically challenging every piece of the prosecution's case. He acknowledged that Morrison's dog had indeed attacked Jessica Martinez, but painted a picture of an animal that had been stolen or manipulated by the real perpetrator, someone who remained free while an innocent man faced life in prison. The prosecution will parade before you DNA evidence, forensic reports, and circumstantial connections, Stone continued, his voice rising with controlled passion. But what they cannot and will not show you is one shred of direct evidence that Jake Morrison was in that park on the morning of January 15th. They will ask you to convict based on suspicion and coincidence, not facts. When Jessica Martinez took the witness stand as the prosecution's first witness, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. She walked slowly to the front of the courtroom, her left hand still bearing faint scars from the dog's teeth, her dark hair pulled back to reveal similar markings along her neck. Despite her obvious nervousness, Jessica's voice remained steady as Chun guided her through her testimony. "I remember walking into the park that morning with Tommy," Jessica testified, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He was so excited because we had promised to feed the ducks in the pond. The next thing I remember clearly is waking up in the hospital 3 days later with doctors telling me I was lucky to be alive." The most heartbreaking moment came when Jessica described her relationship with Tommy and the devastating impact the attack had on both their lives. "Tommy was like a little brother to me," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "He used to chatter constantly, asking questions about everything he saw. Now he barely speaks at all. Sometimes I catch him staring at me with these sad, frightened eyes, and I know he's remembering something terrible that I can't remember myself." During cross-examination, Stone was respectful but thorough, emphasizing Jessica's complete memory loss regarding the actual attack. "Miss Martinez, you have no recollection of seeing my client at the park that morning. Is that correct?" "That's correct," Jessica admitted reluctantly. "And you cannot identify the person who commanded the dog to attack you?" "No, I cannot." As the first day of testimony concluded, Prosecutor Chun felt cautiously optimistic about the jury's response to Jessica's emotional testimony. But she knew that the real test would come when Tommy Rodriguez took the stand, if he could find his voice at all. The second day of Jake Morrison's trial began with an ominous shift in momentum that Prosecutor Linda Chun felt deep in her bones. Defense attorney Richard Stone entered the courtroom with the predatory confidence of a shark sensing blood. In The water, his briefcase bulging with documents and witness statements that promised to dismantle everything the prosecution had worked months to build. Stone's first witness was Dr. Marcus Webb, a forensic expert in animal behavior who had testified in over 300 cases involving dog attacks. Webb commanded immediate respect from the jury, his silver hair and gentle demeanor projected the image of a grandfatherly professor, while his credentials as the former director of the National Canine Behavior Institute lent undeniable authority to his testimony. Dr. Webb, Stone began with theatrical precision. In your expert opinion, is it possible for someone other than a dog's owner to command that animal to attack? Absolutely, Webb replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. Dogs, particularly those that have been abused or trained for fighting, can be manipulated by anyone who understands basic dominance techniques. A stranger with knowledge of command words, aggressive body language, or even certain pheromones can trigger attack responses in animals that have been conditioned for violence. Webb's testimony was devastating to the prosecution's theory that Morrison had specifically commanded his pit bull to attack Jessica Martinez. The expert explained how dog theft rings operated, stealing trained fighting dogs for use in attacks, before abandoning them to avoid detection. He presented case studies from across the country, where innocent dog owners had been falsely accused of commanding attacks carried out by their stolen pets. The DNA evidence proves that Mr. Morrison's dog attacked Miss Martinez, Webb acknowledged during his testimony. But it proves absolutely nothing about who was controlling that animal at the time of the attack. Stone's preparation became evident as he called a parade of witnesses that painted Jake Morrison not as a monster, but as a victim of circumstance. Maria Santos, not the detective, but a neighbor who shared the same name, testified that Morrison's pit bull had been acting strangely in the weeks before the attack, as if someone had been interfering with the animal when Morrison wasn't home. I saw strangers hanging around the building at odd hours, the elderly woman testified, her thick accent adding authenticity to her words. Jake works long shifts at the auto shop, sometimes 12 hours a day. Anyone could have been messing with that poor dog while he was gone. The defense's most explosive witness was Crystal Valdez, Morrison's former girlfriend, who had initially provided damaging statements to police, but now sang a completely different tune, taking the stand in a conservative blue dress that made her look younger than her 26 years. Valdez recanted virtually everything she had told investigators during the initial interviews. I was scared and confused when the police first questioned me, Valdez testified, avoiding eye contact with the prosecution table. I said things about Jake training the dog to attack people, but that wasn't true. Jake loved that dog. He rescued it from a fighting ring and was trying to rehabilitate it. He would never hurt anyone. During cross-examination, Prosecutor Chun attempted to expose the obvious coaching behind Valdez's testimony, but Stone had prepared his witness well. When Chun pressed Valdez about her initial statements describing Morrison as controlling and violent, the young woman broke into tears. Jake never laid a hand on me, Valdez sobbed into the tissue Stone helpfully provided. I was going through a bad time with drugs, and I wasn't thinking clearly when I talked to the police. I said whatever I thought they wanted to hear, so they would leave me alone. The afternoon session brought Stone's most devastating blow, yet the testimony of Tommy Morrison, Jake's younger brother, who had flown in from Phoenix specifically to defend his sibling. Tommy Morrison was everything his older brother wasn't: clean-cut, articulate, and employed as an elementary school teacher. His resemblance to Jake was unmistakable, but where Jake projected menace, Tommy radiated wholesome reliability. My brother has made mistakes in his life, Tommy Morrison testified with quiet dignity, but he's not capable of what you're accusing him of. Jake called me 3 days before this attack happened, crying because his dog had gone missing. He was devastated. That animal was like a child to him. Stone had phone records to back up this claim, showing a 47-minute call between the Morrison brothers on the date Tommy described. The defense attorney also produced veterinary records showing that Jake had spent over $2,000 treating the pit bull's injuries from its previous life as a fighting dog. Hardly the behavior of someone training an animal for violence. Jake was trying to heal that dog, not turn it into a weapon, Tommy Morrison continued, his voice thick with emotion. When the police told him his dog had attacked someone, he was as shocked as anyone. He kept saying it was impossible, that Titan would never hurt an innocent person. The prosecution's case suffered another serious blow when Stone called Detective Rick Thompson from the Narcotics Division, the officer who had originally arrested Morrison on drug charges. Under oath, Thompson admitted that Morrison had seemed genuinely surprised when informed about the dog attack, showing none of the guilt or defensiveness typical of perpetrators confronted with their crimes. Mr. Morrison's reaction was consistent with someone hearing devastating news for the first time. Thompson testified reluctantly. He kept asking if the victim was okay and saying he couldn't understand how his dog could have done such a thing. Stone's closing witness was perhaps his most effective Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a veterinary psychiatrist who had examined Morrison's pit bull after its confiscation. Dr. Harper testified that the animal showed clear signs of recent trauma and conditioning that was inconsistent with Morrison's ownership pattern. This dog had been subjected to intensive attack training in the weeks immediately before the incident. Dr. Harper explained to the riveted jury, "The neural pathways and behavioral responses I observed could only have been created through daily, systematic conditioning. Mr. Morrison's work schedule and the timeline of the training make it impossible for him to have been responsible for this conditioning." As the defense rested their case, Prosecutor Chun watched the jury's faces and felt her confidence crumbling. Stone had masterfully created a narrative where Morrison was as much a victim as Jessica Martinez, a working man whose beloved pet had been stolen and weaponized by unknown criminals who remained free while an innocent man faced life in prison. The reasonable doubt that Stone had promised to create wasn't just present, it was overwhelming. Without Tommy Rodriguez's eyewitness testimony to definitively place Morrison at the scene, Chun realized her case was hanging by the thinnest of threads. The third day of the trial dawned with an air of finality that seemed to weigh on everyone in Courtroom 4A. Prosecutor Linda Chun sat at her table reviewing her closing argument notes for the dozenth time, but the words felt hollow after Richard Stone's devastating defense presentation. The jury looked skeptical, the media sensed blood in the water, and even Judge Harrison seemed resigned to watching the case collapse under the weight of reasonable doubt. Tommy Rodriguez sat in the front row beside his grandmother Elena, his small legs swinging freely from the wooden bench that was too tall for his 3-year-old frame. In his tiny hands, he clutched a worn teddy bear named Chocolate, a constant companion since the attack that had stolen his voice 6 months earlier. Dr. Sarah Williams had recommended bringing the bear to court, hoping that familiar objects might provide some comfort if Tommy's traumatic memories suddenly resurfaced. The morning had begun with final witness preparations in Judge Harrison's chambers, where Chun made one last desperate plea to call Tommy to the stand, despite his continued mutism. "Your Honor, this child is the only person who actually witnessed the attack. Even if he can't speak about what happened, the jury deserves to see him, to understand what trauma looks like in its purest form." Richard Stone had objected vehemently, his polished demeanor cracking slightly as he argued that putting a mute child on the witness stand would be nothing more than emotional manipulation. The prosecution wants to parade a traumatized 3-year-old in front of the jury purely for sympathy. Your Honor, without the ability to testify coherently, the child's presence serves no legal purpose whatsoever. Judge Harrison had ultimately decided that Tommy could remain in the courtroom with his family, but could not be called as a witness unless he demonstrated the ability to communicate about the events in question. It was a compromise that satisfied no one but preserved the integrity of the legal process. As Chun rose to deliver her closing argument, she felt the weight of impending failure pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady despite her internal turmoil. "The defense wants you to believe in an elaborate conspiracy theory where unknown criminals stole Jake Morrison's dog, trained it to attack on command, and used it to assault Jessica Martinez before returning it to its owner. They're asking you to ignore the DNA evidence, the circumstantial connections, and the defendant's suspicious behavior in favor of a story that belongs in a Hollywood thriller, not a courtroom." Chun spent 45 minutes methodically rebuilding her case, emphasizing Morrison's presence near the park on the morning of the attack, his possession of Jessica's identification, and the systematic conditioning that had turned his pit bull into a weapon. But even as she spoke, she could see doubt in the jurors' eyes, doubt that Stone had planted and nurtured with surgical precision. The prosecution's closing was interrupted by an unexpected commotion in the hallway outside the courtroom. Officer Mike Thompson was escorting his canine partner, Rex, through the courthouse for a routine security sweep when the German Shepherd's presence triggered something extraordinary that no one could have anticipated. Tommy Rodriguez, who had been sitting quietly throughout the morning's proceedings, suddenly became agitated as Rex's distinctive footsteps echoed through the marble corridor. The rhythmic clicking of the dog's nails on the polished floor seemed to unlock something deep within the child's traumatized psyche, sound that transported him back to that terrifying morning in Riverside Park. The transformation was immediate and shocking. Tommy's small body went rigid, his teddy bear falling to the courtroom floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. His dark eyes, which had remained unfocused and distant for months, suddenly sharpened with the clarity of recalled terror. Elena Rodriguez reached for her grandson instinctively, but Tommy was already moving. He stood on the wooden bench with the unsteady grace of a child, his tiny arm extending toward the courtroom doors where Rex was passing. In the absolute silence that had fallen over the packed courtroom, Tommy's voice rang out like a bell, the first words he had spoken about the attack since that horrible morning 6 months earlier. "Bad dog." Tommy's voice cracked with emotion, but it carried clearly to every corner of the courtroom. "Bad dog hurt Jessica." The reaction was instantaneous and electric. Elena Rodriguez gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. Judge Harrison's gavel froze halfway to the bench as she stared at the child in amazement. The jury sat transfixed, witnessing what felt like a miracle unfolding before their eyes. But Tommy wasn't finished. The floodgates that had held back his memories for half a year had burst open, and words poured out of him with increasing urgency and clarity. "The mean man told the bad dog to bite Jessica," he continued, his small finger now pointing directly at Jake Morrison. "He said, 'Get her, Titan,' and the bad dog listened." Morrison's face drained of color as Tommy's accusation hit him like a physical blow. The defendant half rose from his chair before Stone's restraining hand pulled him back down, but the damage was done. The jury had seen Morrison's reaction, the guilty flinch of a man confronted with the truth he thought would never surface. Dr. Sarah Williams, who had been observing from the gallery, later explained that Rex's appearance had likely triggered what psychologists call contextual memory recovery. The child's brain had associated the German Shepherd with the pit bull from his traumatic memories, causing a complete breakthrough in his selective mutism. Tommy continued his testimony in the broken but unmistakable language of a 3-year-old who had witnessed unspeakable violence. He described Morrison approaching Jessica in the park, his dog straining on its chain as the man whispered commands in its ear. He recounted the moment when Morrison unclipped the animal's leash and pointed toward Jessica, speaking the attack command that turned a trained fighting dog into a living weapon. Jessica tried to run, Tommy said, his voice growing smaller but no less powerful, but the bad dog was faster. The mean man watched and smiled when the bad dog hurt her. Then he ran away and left Jessica bleeding. The courtroom remained frozen, in stunned silence as Tommy's grandmother gently lifted him into her arms, the child finally exhausted from purging 6 months of suppressed terror. Judge Harrison had to bang her gavel repeatedly to restore order as reporters frantically scribbled notes and spectators whispered in amazement. Richard Stone's objections were swift and predictable. He argued that Tommy's testimony was unreliable, due to his age and traumatic state, that leading questions had contaminated his memories, and that the dramatic circumstances had compromised the child's ability to distinguish between reality and fantasy. But his protests felt hollow in the face of Tommy's raw, authentic recollection of events that only the true perpetrator and victim could have known. The hours following Tommy Rodriguez's breakthrough testimony transformed Courtroom 4A into a battlefield of legal strategy and desperate damage control. Defense attorney Richard Stone, his silver hair now disheveled from running anxious fingers, through it huddled with Jake Morrison in urgent whispered conferences, while prosecutor Linda Chun felt the sweet taste of vindication coursing through her veins for the first time in months. Judge Patricia Harrison had called a 2-hour recess to allow both sides to process the seismic shift in the case, but everyone knew that Tommy's words had already sealed Morrison's fate. The 3-year-old's testimony had been so pure, so untainted by adult coaching or legal manipulation, that it carried a weight no expert witness or forensic evidence could match. In his innocent, broken sentences, Tommy had painted a picture of premeditated violence that no jury could ignore. During the recess, Detective Maria Santos received a call that would provide the final pieces of the puzzle. Morrison's cell phone records, which had been subpoenaed weeks earlier, but required extensive analysis to decode, finally revealed the smoking gun prosecutors had been seeking. The data showed that Morrison had been searching online for attack dog commands and how to train pit bulls to kill in the weeks leading up to the assault. More damning still, Morrison's browser history revealed multiple visits to Jessica Martinez's social media profiles, dating back nearly 2 months before the attack. He had studied her daily routines, her favorite locations for morning walks, and even the schedule she kept when babysitting Tommy. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was a carefully planned assault by a predator who had been stalking his victim for weeks. The digital evidence corroborates every detail of Tommy's testimony, Detective Santos explained to Chun during the break. Morrison researched Jessica's habits, trained his dog specifically for this attack, and chose Riverside Park because he knew she would be there with the child. This was as premeditated as murder gets. When court reconvened, Stone made one final desperate attempt to discredit Tommy's testimony by calling Dr. Marcus Webb back to the stand. The animal behavior expert argued that a 3-year-old's perception of events could be unreliable, that the child might have confused commands or misunderstood what he was witnessing. But Webb's credibility crumbled under Chun's cross-examination. When she presented the digital evidence that perfectly matched Tommy's account, "Dr. Webb," Chun said, her voice steady with conviction, "if someone had researched attack commands online for weeks, practiced those commands with a trained fighting dog, and then used those exact commands at the scene of an assault, would that suggest random dog behavior or deliberate human control?" Webb's admission was reluctant but definitive. That would indicate deliberate human command and control of the animal. The jury deliberation lasted only 47 minutes, an almost unprecedented speed for a felony case of this magnitude. When the 12 men and women filed back into the courtroom, their faces showed the grim determination of people who had witnessed evil and chosen to stand against it. Foreman Margaret Torres, a retired elementary school principal who had spent 30 years working with children Tommy's age, stood to deliver the verdict with tears streaming down her cheeks. We, the jury, find the defendant Jake Morrison guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, guilty of animal cruelty, and guilty of stalking with intent to commit bodily harm. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and sobs as 6 months of tension and uncertainty finally found release. Elena Rodriguez clutched Tommy tightly, whispering prayers of gratitude in Spanish, while Jessica Martinez wept openly at the prosecution table, finally able to begin healing from her nightmare. Morrison's reaction was swift and violent. As the guilty verdicts were read, he lunged toward the witness section, where Tommy sat with his grandmother, screaming threats that had to be bleeped from television coverage. "You little bastard! You ruined everything. I should have killed you both when I had the chance." It took 4 bailiffs to restrain him as he fought like the animal he had trained to attack innocent people. Morrison's outburst provided the final confirmation of his guilt. No innocent man would threaten a 3-year-old witness with such venom and specificity. Judge Harrison immediately ordered Morrison into custody and scheduled sentencing for the following month. 3 weeks later, Judge Harrison delivered a sentence that sent shockwaves through the criminal community. Morrison received 25 years in state prison without the possibility of parole, the maximum sentence allowed under state guidelines for his crimes. In her sentencing statement, Judge Harrison spoke directly to the broader implications of the case. Jake Morrison didn't just assault Jessica Martinez. The judge declared, her voice carrying the weight of moral authority. He weaponized an innocent animal, traumatized a child, and terrorized an entire community. His calculated cruelty and complete lack of remorse demonstrate that he poses a continuing danger to society that can only be addressed through lengthy incarceration. The aftermath of the trial brought healing and hope to those who had suffered most. Jessica Martinez used her survivor's platform to establish the Tommy Rodriguez Foundation for Child Witnesses, providing therapy and support services for young victims of violent crime. The foundation's first initiative was funding a revolutionary program that used therapy dogs to help traumatized children find their voices, fitting tribute to the case that had brought them all together. Tommy's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Within weeks of his courtroom breakthrough, he was chattering constantly again, telling elaborate stories and asking the endless questions that had been silenced by trauma. Dr. Sarah Williams documented his progress as a case study that would help countless other children recover from selective mutism caused by violent crime. Tommy's courage in that courtroom saved lives, Dr. Williams explained in her published research. Morrison had already begun stalking other potential victims when he was arrested. That little boy's 2 words, "bad dog," prevented future attacks and gave voice to every child who has ever witnessed violence. Detective Maria Santos kept a photo from the trial's final day on her desk. Tommy Rodriguez grinning widely while receiving a Medal of Bravery from the police department, his small hand firmly gripping hers as flashbulbs captured the moment. When justice triumphed over evil. In her 23-year career, Santos had worked thousands of cases, but none had reminded her more powerfully why she had become a police officer in the first place. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest truth, and sometimes 2 simple words, spoken by the most vulnerable witness, can bring down the most dangerous predators. Tommy Rodriguez had proven that courage comes in all sizes, and that justice delayed is not always justice denied.